Council want outgoing 911 call center chief Tyrell Morris suspended immediately.
As Sabrina Wilson reports, Morris wasn't available for comment today, but the council member's request comes a day after he announced he's stepping down and weeks after he was involved in an accident in a taxpayer-funded vehicle.
New Orleans 911 Center Chief Tyrell Morris says he is leaving the position in September, citing a desire to refocus on taking better care of himself. His announcement comes after he was involved in a May 7th accident while in a taxpayer-funded vehicle.
Allegedly, there was an accident occurred off duty on a weekend in which Mr. Morris and another vehicle were involved in an accident, two vehicles hitting. And what's supposed to happen, since he was in a communications district vehicle, under the policy that's been in place at least since May 14th of 2019, if a communications district vehicle is involved in an accident, the employee driving that vehicle has to immediately report it and submit to a blood, alcohol, and drug test to determine if he was impaired in any way. So that was the existing policy that was in place.
And now New Orleans City Council members Helena Moreno and J.P. Morrell want Morris suspended immediately. They sent this letter to John Thomas of the Orleans Parish Communication District, pointing to media reports that Morris is under investigation for his alleged actions following a car accident in his publicly funded vehicle. And they also cited media reports raising questions about whether the agency's standard operating procedure 1.3.1 was altered.
And both of them are paragraph E's.
Rafael Goyeneche of the Metropolitan Crime Commission says he's read two different versions of the policy, one which says the operator of the OPCD vehicle must take a drug and alcohol test as soon as possible, and another version stating that if injuries are reported, the operator of the OPCD vehicle must take a drug and alcohol test as soon as possible.
So the original policy read that the operator of an OPCD vehicle must take a drug and alcohol test as soon as possible after a reported accident. The document that was produced to the media contained 4 additional words, and that was, if injuries are reported, the operator of the OPCD vehicle must take a drug and alcohol test as soon as possible. So the question becomes, when was the document that was produced to the media and represented as the official policies of the communication district, when was that document altered and by whose orders?
Goyeneche says the city's inspector general is investigating all things related to the accident.
They're going to have to establish when this additional language was added to this paragraph and under whose orders.
Mayor Cantrell didn't take questions about Morris at a press conference call to talk about the heat wave.
Can we now have the questions?
No, we're done here, folks.
Yeah, I'm doing my weekly briefing on tomorrow.
While Goyeneche says there's a myriad of unanswered questions.
We don't know if Mr. Morris, because he was involved in this accident, attributed the damages to the car to the other driver? And if so, who was responsible for paying for the repair to the vehicle that he was driving, which was a public vehicle? So, don't know if those vehicles are insured or if they're self-insured by the communications district.
Sabrina Wilson, Fox 8 Local First.